I remember the night my husband packed a small bag and told me he needed space. And what stayed with me was not the act itself, but the quiet way he said it, as though he had been arriving at that decision for a while and had finally reached a point where he could no longer remain in the same place with me. It took me some time to understand how we got there, because for a long time, everything in my life had felt like it was moving in the right direction. My work was growing in ways I had hoped for, my decisions felt clear, and the structure I had built around myself gave me a sense of stability that I had worked hard to achieve. At home, things felt settled in a way that I did not question. My husband Emeka had a way of holding that space together without making it feel like effort. His photography work gave him a kind of flexibility that balanced the intensity of my schedule. And over time, I became used to the quiet reliability of that arrangement. There was always food when I forgot to eat. The house remained in order even when my mind felt scattered. And I could return at the end of a long day and feel myself settle without needing to think about it. We never sat down to define what our roles were. We simply lived in a way that worked. And because it worked, I did not think of it as something that needed to be examined too closely. That was the life I believed I understood. It started to shift in a way I did not immediately recognize when my younger brother called me one afternoon to tell me he had lost his job. There was something in his voice that made it clear he was trying to hold himself together. And by the time the conversation ended, I had already begun thinking about how to make space for him without fully considering what that would change. When he asked if he could stay with us for a while, it felt like a natural decision. I did not approach it as something that needed to be carefully discussed or negotiated because in my mind, it was simply what you do for family. I told Emeka that evening, expecting the kind of quiet understanding I had come to rely on, and he responded in that same steady way, asking a few practical questions before agreeing without resistance. At the time, I saw that as support, and I moved on from the moment without thinking much about it.
Kule moved in the following week, and for a while, everything seemed manageable. He spent most of his time searching for work, moving between applications and interviews, and I tried to support him in the spaces my schedule allowed. Emeka treated him with the same calm warmth he extended to anyone who entered our home, and for a short period, it felt like something we could absorb without disrupting the balance we had built. Then my mother called. And that was where the shift began to take a clearer shape, even though I did not fully understand it at the time. She said she wanted to come and help, and her tone carried a kind of urgency that made it difficult to suggest otherwise. She spoke about Kunle, about the house, about everything she believed required attention, and before I had fully thought through what her presence would introduce into our space, I agreed. When I told Emeka, I noticed a brief pause before he responded. It was subtle, the kind of pause that could easily be overlooked, and he followed it with the same calm agreement I had come to expect from him. He adjusted, as he always did, and I took that adjustment as reassurance that everything would remain steady. My mother arrived a few days later, and at first, nothing felt immediately different. She moved through the house with familiarity, observing quietly, asking questions that sounded harmless on the surface. She wanted to understand how things worked, how we organized our days, how responsibilities were shared, and I answered in ways that felt natural to me, without considering how those explanations might sound through her perspective. The first moment that stayed with me came one evening while we were all in the living room. Emeka was moving between the kitchen and the dining area, preparing things for dinner, and my mother watched him for a moment before turning to me. She said I worked very hard, and I agreed with a small smile, already aware that she had more to say. She spoke about how important it was for a woman to be able to stand on her own, and then, after a brief pause, she added that a man should also be seen to be doing something that carries weight. The way she said it was calm, almost casual, and yet the meaning settled into the room with clarity.
Emeka did not react. He continued what he was doing, placing plates on the table with the same steady movements, and that made it easier for me to do what I had already begun to do. which was to let things pass in the hope that they would not grow into something larger. I explained his work, the nature of photography, the flexibility that made our arrangement work, and my mother listened without arguing, though I could tell she was holding on to her own understanding of what things should look like. The conversation moved on, but something had already been introduced into this space. After that, the comments did not stop. They changed form. Sometimes they came as questions directed at Emeka, asked politely but carrying an underlying expectation about what his answers should sound like. Other times they came to me in private, framed as advice about responsibility, about perception, about how things appeared to other people. I found myself thinking about those conversations during the day, in moments where my mind should have been fully focused on work. They did not take over my attention completely, but they lingered in a way that was new. And slowly, that tension began to show in how I spoke. I became sharper in ways that did not feel intentional, more direct in moments that did not require it. Emeka noticed. He did not confront me. He responded by adjusting, by trying to hold things steady even as the atmosphere around us shifted. That steadiness, which had once felt effortless, began to feel like something he was choosing deliberately. The evening everything became clear. I arrived home and noticed that there were more cars than usual in the compound. My mother told me we had a guest, and I moved through the introductions without asking too many questions, adjusting in the way I had been adjusting to everything else. The conversation started easily, moving through familiar topics, and for a while, it felt like a normal gathering. Then, my mother began to speak about me, about my work, about the effort I had put into building my career, and I could sense a certain pride in the way she described it. Gradually, the conversation shifted. She spoke about the importance of support, about how a woman in my position needed the right kind of partner, and our guest responded in agreement, adding his own thoughts about balance and shared ambition. I felt the direction of the conversation before it fully settled, and when my mother turned to Emeka and asked about his work, I knew that what was being said was no longer casual. He answered calmly, explaining what he was doing, the direction he was taking, and the way his work functioned. And he did it without defensiveness, without trying to prove anything beyond what was necessary. My mother listened, then spoke about stability in a way that made her expectations clear without stating them directly. I sat there, aware of everything that was being implied, aware of the moment where I could have spoken, where I could have shifted the direction of the conversation, and I did not. Later that night, after everything had settled, Emeka told me he needed space. He spoke calmly, without anger, without accusation, and that made it harder to respond because there was nothing in his tone that I could push against. He said he was not leaving the marriage, that he just needed time away, to think and to breathe without adjusting to something he no longer recognized. I stood there, knowing that anything I said in that moment would come from a place that had not yet fully understood what had been lost. So I said nothing. And when he left, the house did not feel empty. It felt different. The next morning, I moved through my routine as I always did, but there was a growing awareness that something I had relied on without thinking had been removed. I found myself standing in the kitchen at one point, looking at the order he had always maintained and realizing how much of my life had been supported by something I had treated as constant. That realization unfolded slowly, connecting itself to moments I had dismissed, to conversations I had allowed to pass, to the ways I had adjusted without questioning where those adjustments were coming from. By the time I returned home that evening, I knew I could not avoid the conversation any longer. I spoke to my mother first. I told her I understood her intentions, but I also told her that the way things had been said and the way Emeka had been treated had changed the atmosphere of our home in a way I could no longer ignore. I told her that the life we had built worked, even if it did not fit into what she expected, and that I needed our home to return to that place. It was not a loud confrontation. It was a clear one. That night, I called Emeka. I told him I had been thinking, that I finally understood how things had shifted and that I could see now how much of what I had built had been supported by his presence. He did not say much, but I could hear the difference in his silence. And for the first time since he left, that silence did not feel distant. As I sat there after the call ended, I realized that the life I had built had never been mine alone in the way I had once believed. It had been shaped by the space we created together, by the balance we maintained without naming it, by the quiet support I had grown used to without fully acknowledging. This time, I allowed that understanding to settle fully, and I did not let it pass unnoticed.